I'm here with John Day, author of Cyclogeography, a wonderful book. I'll get a shot of the book in there. Imagine that's in my hand. I'll drop that in somehow. So today, instead of walking, look, cycling. For me, this is the first time in 14 years I've been on a bike, and that was in a completely pedestrianised city. And it says a lot about my relationship with cycling, John, that my aim for today is not to die. That's why we're cycling in the Olympic Park. It's the only reason.
The perfect place for it.
So we're going to ride these bikes, and I'm going to try and conduct some sort of interview. We'll try and talk about your book as we ride, and then we'll see what we get.
Good.
Excellent.
On the wheel. It's a book about the 3 years I spent as a bicycle courier, working as a bicycle courier in London. And I suppose I wrote it partly because being a courier gives you a lot of time sitting around. Time that I spent reading about London and cycling, and it struck me that there's something quite similar about both occupations, right? Riding and writing, and in a sense I guess I wanted to explore that image of the bike as the bicycle journey as a sort of form of narrative. And obviously the whole thing's kind of terrible but irresistible pun on psychogeography and this tradition of London writing. So the people I was reading in this time, in this period of my life, were, I guess, the sort of canonical psychogeographers, such as yourself.
And more than just a pun on I
but it isn't,
is it?
Well, it started as a pun, and it partly. But I do think, I mean, there is this great tradition of walking writing that obviously goes back far beyond the 20th century and to the Romantics and potentially beyond. And I was struck by the kind of relative absence of the bicycle as a vehicle for this kind of writing, especially as it has this strange hybridity that I found sort of attractive. So if you think of kind of second waves, or psychogeography proper, emerging from all of these quite modernist impulses in the arts and writing, and the bicycle seems to be quite a kind of modernist vehicle in many respects, not just because of the historical period in which it was kind of invented and refined, but in its standing as a metaphor for the union of bodies and machines in various ways. And I did unearth this kind of interesting seam of literature dealing with this theme with Beckett and Flannery O'Brien and Alfred Jarry, the French surrealist, who obviously is the kind of patron saint of a form of surreal and absurd bicycle writing. One thing that I've always found quite exciting but also maybe slightly difficult to work out about psychogeography is how seriously to take the whole thing. Yeah. And he seems to be a good progenitor of that confusion in some respects. What I would like to do, in a sense, with this book is reclaim its radicalism, not in a kind of protest, reclaim the streets sense, although that stuff's important, but as a kind of wonderfully bizarre metaphysical vehicle, like just a curious thing. No one knows how bikes work. They're weird. I've got sort of two fledgling theories about why Europe has embraced the bicycle race far more than, or continental Europe, far more than Britain has, and I think it's partly to do with national identity and narratives of national identity that the bike race can generate, that I talk about in the book. So this idea of, which is Barth's notion of the Tour de France giving French people their first look at a map of France, really, a first sense of how the country fitted together, because it was a big national event narrated through newspapers with a huge circulation that stitched the country together for them, beating of the bounds kind of thing. And Italy explicitly politicised the bicycle race in the 20th century, in the early 20th century. The first Giro d'Italia after the Second World War was rechristened the Giro of Rebirth, and it was this sense of uniting a country that had obviously been far more fragmentary in historical terms than many other European ones. I suppose I did begin to think of couriering as that kind of a way of looking, discovering unlooked for spaces, and certainly you get this privileged access to parts of the city that even walkers aren't really allowed access to, such as, under giant more London and those kind of huge commercial developments, that function as these little isolated outposts with their own rules and their own systems that you can't really get into unless you work there. Whereas as a courier, you're granted this kind of anonymity and a right to knock on the goods doors and get in the goods lifts and see the back of the city in that way.
I mean, what's interesting for me, right, as a walker, is you tend to think, no, the walker is the primary kind of narrator and kind of person who understands the city. You know, when you're on feet, you feel the city through your feet and in your legs, and you're free. You're not surviving. The instinct I talk about cyclists surviving. Whereas a walker is kind of free to commune with the spirit of the city. However, in your book, I like the way you describe the relationship between cycling and what my friend Nick Papadimitriou terms deep topography, in the sense that, you know, you become aware of river valleys even if you weren't looking for them.
Yeah, it's a very unconscious thing.
Yeah.
Because the bike, like water, wants to flow downhill, you kind of unconsciously map the paths of least resistance. I mean, I talk about this again quite a lot in the book, but yeah, there's a sense in which getting on a bike makes you attuned to kind of older ways of travel. Graham Robb says this, and I think it's very true. You know, you kind of unconsciously uncover the pilgrim paths, or the hollow ways, the old ways, and that's true, I think. But I also think that kind of urban cycling, as distinct from the kinds of things that happen on the Tour or the great road races, which are kind of primarily weirdly rural events, although we can kind of talk about that a bit maybe, in that the bike and the kind of modern city grew up alongside each other, really.
Right.
Especially somewhere in if you look at the new city, somewhere like New York, but road surfaces are completely dependent on the advocacy of bike groups. You know, people think that the roads were built for cars, but as Carlton Reid has argued very persuasively, I think, in a recent book, he says that, you know, it was bicycle touring clubs in the early 20th century and late 19th, early 20th century that really advocated for mass macadamisation of the road network. So, in a sense, inhabiting streets, of course, pavements are a contested battleground perhaps in this relationship between walker and cyclist, but streets themselves, I think, were kind of, they're parallel developments. So it seemed like the bike was actually a very appropriate way in which to encounter a city.